John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com, at JF McMullen on Twitter. A lot of NFL news and notes to dive into as well. The Giants make it official. Pat Shurmur is the new head coach, and Steve Wilks will be the new head coach in Arizona for the Cardinals. And we'll see what that means for John DeFilippo, Jim Schwartz, and Frank Reich, the three coordinators, John, who are getting ready for the Super Bowl. But as we have this news about Wilks in Arizona and Shurmur in New York, are any of the Eagles, specifically DeFilippo, on the list of potential coordinators in those spots?
Yeah, I would think John's going to get a coordinator job somewhere. He's out of contract after the Eagles season ends, so they can't prevent him from moving. And he's obviously a well-regarded guy. When you get head coaching interviews and you're just a position coach, it kind of tells you how well-regarded he is. So I think it's going to be very difficult for the Eagles to keep him, because obviously he wants to take the next step in his career, and it's easier to get a head coaching job coming off a coordinator position. So not only do you have to look at teams that are obvious that just hired head coaches, but, you know, the Jets, who wanted him last year, are in play for an offensive coordinator again. Minnesota, that just lost Pat Shurmur, they just saw how good the Eagles were. They could be in play. So there's a lot of potential places where he could land. And ultimately, you know, obviously the Eagles, unless they want to move on from Frank Reich, and I don't see why they would want to do that, they can't offer him an offensive coordinator position, so it's going to be difficult.
Now, when a new coach is hiring an offensive coordinator, a lot of times is that, you know, you have a background. Does that come from the GM? How does that typically happen?
Well, it depends. Every situation is different. I mean, generally, the biggest part of a head coaching interview in sort of the modern environment is what kind of staff can you put together.
Right.
And that was a lot of what caused teams to hesitate with John as a head coaching candidate, is because he's probably not in the position to put together a really top-tier staff. So that could have hurt him as far as head coaching positions. But there are other instances, and this is a perfect example of one, where the Eagles hired Doug Pederson, but they made the decision that Jim Schwartz was going to be the defense coordinator. So it depends on the situation, but generally the head coach is the one who makes the decision on the coordinators.
Talk with John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. Follow him at JF McMullen. The coordinator spoke today, John, and I guess, you know, on the offensive side is Frank Reich, who, you know, we don't know how much he does maybe to help game plan or what his role really is. But, you know, he has to have some major positive impact on why this offense has been successful. You know, we just had Joe Callahan in here, the backup quarterback in Green Bay, and he was talking about how, you know, they did the film study of Minnesota and how just he was pretty surprised at how well the Eagles were able to move the ball. And a lot of that is we think that Doug Pederson just outclassed Mike Zimmer on that day. How much does Frank Reich, you know, play a role in that as well?
Oh, he plays a huge role. I mean, I think people kind of forget. I mean, there are always offensive or defensive-minded head coaches, and it comes into fruition, and they generally have coordinators unless you're Hugh Jackson, and the coordinators generally don't call the plays, whether it's the offensive or defensive side, but they do everything else as far as putting together the game plan and being involved in it and things of that nature, and putting together the play sheet. And in this case, it's Doug Pederson and Frank Reich, and Doug obviously calls the plays. So they both deserve a ton of respect. They did completely outcoach Minnesota and Zimmer's a highly regarded guy. So, you can't give him as many accolades as you can throw at him today. It's the Maxwell Football Club named Doug the Pro Coach of the Year today. I think he should have got the Coach of the Year from the Pro Football Writers. I voted for him. I think he should get the AP award, but he probably won't. It'll probably be Sean McVay. The guy's been unbelievable as a play call. And for whatever reason, because of how it started, and so many people were down on him, and so many people didn't think he was a good hire, and then you have the Mike Lombardi criticisms, I don't understand it. The guy has been unbelievable as a head coach.
What are some of the things that he needed to fix and did? Where was he? Where were maybe you questioning or people questioning him from last year's 7-9 team that he needed to improve on?
Well, me personally, I was not questioning him. And it's not trying to say that I was ahead of the curve. I just thought he overachieved. I thought in the type of situation he was in, and from being there every day, and we can go back to last year and talk about the trade 8 days before the regular season. Sam Bradford was supposed to be the starting rookie who basically didn't have a training camp because he was hurt, preseason, I should say, because he got hurt in that first preseason game. And you're thrown in the mix. And I remember predicting on this show maybe the Eagles will get 4 or 5 wins. They ended up with 7. It's not great, but if you look at the totality of the circumstances, it was a pretty impressive job. And then I always pointed to the off-the-field stuff. When Sam Bradford was upset when the Eagles drafted Carson Wentz, he handled that very well as a rookie coach. When Nelson Aguilar and Josh Huff and Nigel Bradham had incidents with the law, he handled those things very well. And I could see this guy is a leader. He is a leader. And unlike the previous head coach, because he played in this league for over a decade, I thought he understood the locker room. That has all proved to be true. He's been a very good X's and O's coach, and I think that surprised people. But the bigger thing for me has always been the way he's handled this locker room and the fact that he's got all 53 guys, and really it's closer to 63 and 70 when you talk about the practice squad, the guys on injured reserve. He's got them all on the same page. That is the most difficult job for any coach in this league, and he's hit a home run from that aspect of it.
John, there's a lot of talk, leading up to a team that goes to the Super Bowl about how they were built and ownership. And it's, interesting because, again, we just had Joe Callahan in here, and he's been with Green Bay. He spent a short period in New Orleans, and he was in Cleveland. Cleveland, not the most stable situation. Green Bay, typically one of the most stable. The Saints, one of the more stable ones. And how important to have stable ownership and front office. So I want to start with Jeffrey Lurie, who you wrote about today at 973ESPN.com, actually yesterday, and that you say validation is in his reach. He's owned the team for 24 years, and the Eagles under his watch have been very successful. I mean, everything short of a Super Bowl they've accomplished and done it maybe with more stability than any other team except for the Patriots. So how is, in your mind, Lurie viewed, and what is this validation that he is could potentially reach?
Well, the validation is obviously winning the Super Bowl, because this is an organization that hasn't had one, obviously, and it hasn't won a championship since 1960. But they have been very successful. And if you do take a step back and look at it logically, and the fact that, as you mentioned, when he bought the team in 94, and this was the sixth championship game, and obviously the Andy Reid era was so successful, but it didn't result in a championship. And I generally don't criticize Jeffrey for moving on, because I do think coaches have shelf lives in this league, and I thought Andy's time was up here. It's not to say he wasn't a very good coach. He's proven he's continued to be a very good coach in Kansas City. The big mistake was Chip Kelly, and that was a huge mistake. And even more so than bringing him in as the coach, because he was okay. He was above 500, especially early. He did some very, very solid things. But then moving away from the guy he trusts the most, and that's Howie Roseman, in giving Chip Kelly personnel power, that was the biggest mistake of his entire ownership regime here, and we're talking nearly a quarter century, as you mentioned. That was the worst mistake he's made. And you could look at it two ways and say, what are you thinking? Or you can give him credit for realizing the error of his ways and doing a 180. Because I don't know another owner in this league that would have backtracked the way he did and brought in the guy that he replaced.
You know what, though? Isn't it twofold on that, though, that you give him credit for taking the shot of Kelly and also recognizing that he made a mistake?
No, not the first part, because it was such a bad decision, and he was basically being held hostage. Look, I had no problem if you want to have Chip Kelly be your head coach. I ultimately, from a personal level, I don't think you're going to be successful, but I understand it. He adds some really innovative things as far as offensive football goes. But when you talk about the personnel aspect of the job, that's clearly he was not in any position to handle that part of it. And there was no evidence that he could do it. He had never done it before, obviously. He was not very good at it. And Jeffrey should have stood his ground and said, look, you can coach this team. That's what I hired you for. Or you're not going to run the personnel department. And at that point, it's Chip's decision. If he walked away, he walked away. I think that part of it was a really, really egregious mistake. But to his credit, as I said, he realized that very, very quickly, and he changed course. And I don't know many people who are in that position of life, and let's be honest, there's some big egos when you're talking about billionaires, who will freely admit in public, now obviously he didn't say it in those words, but by the actions you're admitting, look, I made a huge mistake, and I'm going to go back and put in what at least was a good, sound structure, and it's been proven to work now.
You know, it's funny because Lurie, you know, the gold standard and the Reed era, over the last, you look back to how far we go back here. Under his ownership, no other NFC East team has been to the playoffs more or NFC championships. 13 postseason appearances and 6 NFC championships, yet no Super Bowl, and therefore Lurie's kind of maybe not regarded as one of the better owners in the league.
Yeah, and he should be. He really should be, because when you do compare it to other situations, as you mentioned, you had Joe in the studio, and he was able to do that. I mean, yeah, when you compare anybody to the New England Patriots, they don't look good. But there aren't many organizations outside of New England that can boast 6 championship game appearances. And you do want to get the big game. And I think ultimately if they got it in Super Bowl 39, this would be a completely different narrative. Mm-hmm. It's only one football game that they lost by a field goal. Logically, that doesn't change anything that's going on. But emotionally, it changes everything. And that's what one win would do here. It really doesn't change that much from a logical standpoint. This has been a really, really good organization. But it means everything to this fan base from an emotional perspective.
We opened up the show asking about Roseman and the timeline of what people believe. And, I said, look, it's time for people to call in and apologize to Roseman. You're not a football guy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. I remember being at the press conference, Jeffrey Lurie in 2000 after 11 saying, look, we used to go off of Andy's board, but Howie made his own draft board. We're going to let him have more input.
Shadow draft board.
Right? He's in the like all of us would do. We have our own draft board, and we want to see how it matches up. And in 2012, when he said that we're going to have Howie's board have more influence, that was maybe the best draft they've had. That's Fletcher Cox, Michael Kendricks, Foles was in that draft, somebody else in the third round that was a pretty good player. So how do we kind of look at the Howie Roseman of the past?
Well, for some reason, Howie came up in an unconventional fashion to get this job. There's no question about it. And we talk about, Chip used to always talk about football guys. I need a football guy. And Howie's not a traditional football guy. And I put that in quotations. But we get into this who's responsible as if the Eagles are any different than any other team. I think, some of these famous general managers, even legendary general managers, they all had personnel departments. They all had scouts. They all had lieutenants. Everybody was involved. It's not one guy. It's never been one guy. Now, ultimately, the buck has to stop with somebody. And if there is a legitimate sort of fight between two prospects at a particular position in the draft, somebody's got to put their foot down and say, we're taking this guy. And that's Howie's position now. It hasn't always been his position. But I don't think that happens as much as people think it does. You do it as a staff with Joe Douglas and the scouts and everybody else, and they have players they like and players they don't like. Mm-hmm. I don't think you're going through 7 rounds of the draft and Howie's saying, no, we got to take this guy. It's a cumulative thing with everybody weighing in, and you make a decision. Part of Howie's job is putting together a good personnel department, and he deserves credit for putting together one of the best personnel departments in this league that was gutted under Chip Kelly, and he did it in a lightning quick fashion. So people should apologize. And by the way, Mike, you should open up tomorrow's show with apologies to Doug Pederson, because nobody believed in Doug Pederson.
I have a lot of time to fill between now and Super Bowl Sunday. So. Jim Schwartz was asked today about, is this like a road game because it's a neutral field game? He said, I don't know. I haven't played any neutral site games, which is right. But, yesterday Pederson mentioned that the L.A. game was kind of like a blueprint they're going to follow for this game. So what is this week like for the Eagles?
Well, this week they're trying to make it as a normal practice week. Push back a day. Thursday will be the big practice day instead of Wednesday. So this is sort of like a week if they had a Monday night football game, and then obviously they have the extra week to prepare, and they're going to be out in Minneapolis, which is some of the issues with the Super Bowl. I mean, there's so many people tugging at your time. So you not only have the practices, you have all the media attention, which is significant here in Philadelphia, but it takes on a whole new level when you get out in the Super Bowl. And obviously that's a concern because the Patriots are used to it and nobody else is. But the Eagles are no different than any other team. If you're not New England, you're not used to Super Bowl week. So it's something that Doug has to kind of figure out. But the positive is that he has pushed just about every single right button this season And I expect that to continue this week and next week.
Yeah, and obviously, as you mentioned, you're playing against a team who's done this week 8 times in the last 10 years, so they're quite familiar what's happening against a team that is relatively new to this. You wonder how much Chris Long and LeGarrette Blount, guys like that, will have input with the coaches, because that seemingly is one of the things that Pederson does well, is listen to his players.
Yeah, he does. And remember, Doug's has been through it as a player as well. And they have other guys,
though.
Torrey Smith, Donnell Ellerbe, have also won Super Bowls. So there are guys in that locker room, Malcolm Jenkins, another, who understand it. But, it's tough. I think the astonishing thing to me, and I just wrote about it, and the Eagles are 13 years off, their last Super Bowl appearance, and they're facing the same hurdle. It is astonishing what the Patriots have accomplished.
And 14 years ago, it's the same coach and the same quarterback.
Well, that's the point. If you think about the Eagles in Super Bowl 39, and where they've been since that day, and Andy Reid era ends, and you go to Chip Kelly, and now we're at Doug Pederson, and you think about Donovan McNabb being the quarterback, and we go to Kevin Cobb and Michael Vick and Nick Foles and Mark Sanchez and Sam Bradford and Carson Wentz, and they get to the Super Bowl again, and it's Belichick and Brady. It is unfathomable what they've been able to accomplish. And since that, there have been 13 seasons, obviously. Since that time, they've made the playoffs 12 times of the 13 seasons. The only time they didn't is when Tom got hurt. I forget the number of championship game appearances, but it's 7 in a row, and this will be their 5th Super Bowl since that Super Bowl. It's daunting, and let's just put it that way.
John McMullen, obviously, with more on the Super Bowl on our website, 973ESPN.com, at JF McMullen. 13 years apart, the same hurdle awaits. Check that article out right now at 973ESPN. And don't forget, you can vote for John McMullen for your favorite Sports Bash segment now in our Sports Bash Awards at 973ESPN.com. You're in the lead right now.
I appreciate it, and I want to thank the listeners, but they should apologize to Doug and Howie.
Although Teron Davenport, by the way, has got a ton of write-ins catching you.
All right. Well, Teron's a good guy. We're friends. So.
We'll see if we can get more apologies today. Thanks, pal.
All right. Thanks, Mike.